The snow fell softly on the town square, blanketing the granite statues and wooden benches in a thick layer of white powder. It settled heavily on the slate roof of the old clock tower, silencing the entire town with a heavy, muffled quiet that you could physically feel pressing against your chest. For over 100 years, that tower had been the steady heartbeat of this place, a constant rhythm that told us we were alive and moving forward. But tonight, the massive iron hands were frozen solid at exactly 12 minutes past 3. The great iron bell, which usually sang out to mark the hour, was cold and silent, and the people walked by quickly on the sidewalk, pulling their wool coats tight around their necks and refusing to look up because seeing the broken face of the clock was a painful reminder of things lost and time running out. I stood there and watched a young couple hurry past, clutching shopping bags, and saw an old man shake his head as he stared at the ground, everyone ignoring the festive wreaths and the colorful lights strung up for Christmas Eve. Without that familiar mechanical sound, the winter air felt completely empty, like a room where someone loved had just stopped breathing. As the wind picked up, I understood that the story behind that terrible silence wasn't just a broken gear or a rusted spring. It was a silent war between the past and the future, waging behind the frosted glass of a narrow shop on Main Street. Inside, Elias Thorne sat hunched at a workbench that had been worn smooth by 50 years of toil, in a room that smelled deeply of cedar wood, whale oil, and immense patience. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, grandfather clocks standing like soldiers, cuckoos waiting in their houses, and pocket watches hanging in rows, all ticking in a chaotic, beautiful rhythm that sounded like a choir to his trained ears. At 72, his hands were spotted with age and swollen with arthritis, but the moment he picked up a pair of steel tweezers, the shaking stopped and he became a surgeon of time. He held a tiny brass gear up to the dim lamplight, admiring its absolute perfection, while just outside his window, the modern world was loud, fast, and obsessed with glass touchscreens rather than solid brass gears. He looked up at the peeling gold paint of his sign, feeling like a dusty relic that had been left behind, but his quiet reflection was shattered by a sharp, confident knock that rattled the glass. It was the unmistakable sound of authority demanding to be heard. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the workbench. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was, or to know that the man standing on the other side of that door hadn't come to fix a watch. He had come to destroy Elias's entire world, letting a gust of freezing wind cut through the shop's cozy warmth. Wearing expensive leather gloves that he didn't bother to remove, Sterling walked to the counter and placed a thick, white envelope on the wood, an object that looked less like a letter and more like a surrender flag waiting to be waved. He smiled, though the expression didn't reach his cold eyes, and said softly that his offer was incredibly generous and that it was finally time for Elias to go home and rest. He gestured vaguely at the broken tower visible through the window, describing it as a liability that kept the town stuck in the past, offering to replace it with a functional digital display that would show the weather, the news, and finally give the town something reliable. Sterling leaned in close and warned that progress does not wait for any man, and that the deadline to sign the deal was tonight, a statement that made the air in the small shop feel suddenly thin, creating a terrifying feeling of suffocation, of being buried alive under the crushing weight of a new, indifferent world. Elias stared at the white envelope without touching it, his heart beating a slow, painful rhythm against his ribs as he thought of his late wife, Martha, who had always believed that time was a precious gift to be cherished, not a commodity to be measured and sold. A part of him thought that maybe Sterling was right, and that he was just a stubborn old fool holding onto a piece of driftwood while the rest of the town changed and the old buildings crumbled to dust. A digital tower would certainly be efficient, accurate, and easy to maintain, but a sharp, hot pain of grief pierced his chest at the thought of being erased and forgotten while he was still alive to see it. He looked at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light like tiny stars and realized with sudden clarity that if he signed that paper, his entire universe would vanish and the silence outside would win forever. He reached for his fountain pen with fingers that were trembling violently, but as he looked down, the black ink in the bottle looked like a dark, bottomless hole waiting to swallow him whole. Just before his hand could obey that temptation, Elias flicked on the small, dust-covered radio to drown out the sudden loudness in his own head. All he heard was an announcer buzzing excitedly about the massive Revitalize Rural America grant, a program promising billions of dollars for small towns, but only if they could prove their infrastructure was unfailingly reliable in any crisis. He listened as the announcer confirmed the crucial catch. The entire town's future depended on a single Christmas Eve inspection, timed perfectly during the tower ceremony. If it went well, the town would instantly receive paved roads, new jobs, and a hopeful future. If it failed, they got absolutely nothing. Elias instantly understood why Sterling had been pushing so ruthlessly. The sleek digital tower wasn't just an upgrade, it was Sterling's guaranteed shortcut, arguing that the antique clock was too fragile to survive a storm and would cost everyone the money. The radio praised connectivity and efficiency, while completely ignoring the value of history, and Elias felt like a profound mistake, a lonely man standing directly in the middle of a modern highway blocking the traffic. As the familiar notes of Silent Night began to play over the dusty speakers, the irony tasted bitter in his mouth because the bell wouldn't ring, but the check would definitely clear, and just as he accepted this crushing truth, he looked back at his workbench and saw a simple object resting there that changed the weight of his decision. It was a heavy, tarnished brass key, the master key to the clock tower that he had personally held for over 30 years. He looked at the thick, white surrender envelope on the counter, then back at the key, realizing he wasn't choosing between money and retirement, but between two utterly different paths. One was safe, easy, and bought his peace, and the other was impossible, terrifying, and demanded a fight. The town genuinely needed the money, he knew that, but the question burned in his mind: did they really have to sell their very soul to get it? He realized then that you cannot build a future on empty air or cheap plastic. You build it slowly and painfully on foundations made of solid stone. A hot, undeniable wave of anger sparked and spread through his empty stomach, reminding him that he wasn't a forgotten ghost. He was a master mechanic. He grabbed his heavy leather tool bag, which felt familiar and powerful in his grasp, flipped the sign on the door to closed, with a decisive click, and stepped out into the biting wind. He was no longer just an old man, but a small, determined figure marching into the tower shadows, looking exactly like a soldier reporting for an impossible assignment, where the heavy brass key turned in the lock with a loud, metallic clack, granting him entry to a different kind of cold. The freezing air inside the tower smelled sharply of ancient grease, metal corrosion, and dry pigeon dust. He began the ascent, climbing the 104 steep spiral steps, his body protesting violently as his arthritis flared up like needles stabbing into his knees and hips. With every single step, he felt more and more like a criminal in his own town, but the pain was instantly forgotten when he looked out a narrow arrow slit of a window. He could see the dark street below and spotted a single, frail light glowing in a hallway 3 streets over. It was Mrs. Gable's house. She was 80 years old and lived alone, and she had once confessed to him that the deep chime of the clock was her friend, a comforting voice that told her she had survived another hour of the dark night. He looked at that distant light, so fragile yet persistent, and realized it was hope waiting for its sound. If he walked away now, that light would listen for a recording, a lie. He realized he wasn't fighting for the grant or the council. He was doing this for the persistent truth and for Mrs. Gable, which is why he finally turned his full attention to the massive, silent heart of the clock waiting in the small glass mechanism room. Looming over him were huge brass gears, thick ropes, and silent iron weights, all frozen still. He shone his small lamp onto the escapement, which is the tiny essential valve that regulates the entire machine and creates the ticking sound, and he instantly found the problem. The mechanism wasn't broken, it was suffocated. Someone had used modern synthetic grease on the century-old components, and in the deep cold of the tower, that grease had turned completely into a sticky glue. He knew the absolute truth: traditional clocks demand only traditional oil to breathe. The entire machine was paralyzed, and Elias felt a deep surge of pity for the old mechanism. He set down his bag, took out his solvent, and began the brutal work. Scrub, scrape, wipe, polish. There were 60 delicate teeth on that single wheel, and the job took hours of agonizing effort in the relentless cold. He used a precise micrometer to check the exact spacing between the pivots, because he knew that if the gap was off by even a fraction of a millimeter, the clock would certainly stop, and he worked relentlessly until the loud, unwelcome sound of men's voices echoed up the stone shaft, and the door below slammed shut with a finality that made Elias jump. He instantly killed his lamp and crouched low behind the main brass gear, watching as Sterling and the mayor stomped into the room. Sterling gestured toward the empty wall space next to the massive mechanism, his voice calm and reasonable. "Once the inspection passes tonight, we repurpose this room," he explained, "and install the secure server racks here." When the mayor worried about losing the historic charm for the grant committee, Sterling offered a tired, patient smile, like a parent explaining math to a child. Charm is a luxury we can't afford, Mayor. The grant demands reliability. He pointed to the corner. That's why I authorized the backup speakers. Digital chime, perfect timing, zero maintenance. It guarantees we get the funding. A heavy chill went through Elias's body as he realized Sterling wasn't being malicious. He simply didn't see the value of the past, only the efficiency of the future. Sterling rested a gloved hand on the cold brass of the ancient mechanism, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before speaking. It's a beautiful piece of engineering, he said, almost convincing himself. Then his jaw tightened. But we can't let nostalgia cost this town millions. They left, and the door slammed again, creating a crushing silence, but that silence was now infinitely heavy with a terrible, shameful secret that physics was about to fight him harder than Sterling ever could. As he cleaned the metal, he realized the temperature had dropped too low, bringing a hard truth about metal. It shrinks when it gets cold. In a clock tower, the pendulum rod is made of iron, and when the temperature drops by 20 degrees, that iron rod contracts and gets shorter. A shorter pendulum swings faster, meaning if Elias fixed the clock now in this freezing cold, it would run fast and gain minutes every hour. By the ceremony, the bell would ring 10 minutes early, proving Sterling right that the old machine was unreliable. Elias looked at the thermometer reading 10 degrees and knew he needed to lower the bob of the pendulum to compensate, but the adjustment nut was rusted solid and fused to the rod. He tried to turn it with his pliers, but it didn't move. He tried a larger wrench, but it wouldn't budge. The metal groaned, and Elias stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew the physics. If he forced it 1 millimeter further, the rod would snap, and the town's chance at the grant would be gone forever. He stared at the rusted nut, realizing he was trapped. He had no spare parts and no time, but as he looked at the small propane torch on the floor, he realized there was one dangerous option left. One that would either save the town or burn the tower to the ground, a small piece of iron that had become an immovable object standing between him and victory. The cold air seemed to mock him, whispering that he was too old and weak to revitalize something frozen through. The wrench fell from his hand, clattering on the stone floor with a lonely sound, and he looked at his bleeding hands, feeling the tears prick his eyes because he had spent his whole life fixing things, but he couldn't fix the world moving on. He looked at the sleek black plastic speaker mounted in the corner, ready to take over, and felt that Sterling had won. Elias thought about the envelope on his desk, realizing he could still sign it and take the money without anyone knowing he had tried. He felt a heavy shame like wet wool, believing he had failed the town, his wife, and himself. He pulled his coat tight, prepared to walk down those stairs and never look back, to sell the shop and forget. The dream felt over as he stood there in the cold tower, just a fool fighting a ghost war, until he looked back at the rusted nut and then at the flame of the small propane torch he had brought to warm his hands. He remembered simple physics: heat expands while cold contracts. It was risky because if he heated the nut too much, he could melt the lead in the pendulum bob, but if he heated it too little, nothing would happen. He had to be a surgeon again, so he picked up the torch and clicked the igniter, the blue flame hissing a sound of defiance. He brought the flame to the metal, watching the color change as he counted the seconds. He seized the wrench, his knuckles turning white, and with a sharp, desperate grunt, forced the heated nut to finally turn. There was only the work, the fire, and the iron, and he focused entirely on the moment of truth arriving on Christmas Eve. Below, the ceremony started, and Sterling raised the remote to start the pre-recorded broadcast just as Elias grabbed the heavy cold iron of the pendulum. He pulled it back like the string of a great bow, and as the second hand on his watch hit 12, he released it. Swish, tick-tock, the escapement caught and released, and the great iron hammer rose up against gravity. It fell not with a digital beep, but with a physical collision of metal on metal that exploded from the tower. The deep, rich sound vibrated through the stone and hit the crowd like a wave, causing Sterling to drop his remote. The crowd cheered, crying at the voice of their home, and the mayor turned his back on Sterling, leaving the developer alone with his useless remote. So, the next morning, the for sale sign was gone from the window of Thorne's timepieces. I walked by the shop and saw the door open, the smell of cedar drifting out to mix with the pine and snow. Elias slept in his chair, solid and unmoving, while a line of people stretched out the door holding broken things they wanted fixed, not replaced. At the end of the line, Sterling stood quietly, turning an expensive gold watch in his hands. High above us, the tower struck the quarter hour, a sound of endurance that reminded us that when the cold wind blows, we don't reach for the plastic screen, but for the things that have stood the test of time.